What is the creepiest thing you've seen in the woods, in the mountains or anywhere else? I was up north, far north British Columbia, Canada, working in a oil rig camp out in the woods. I was working as a cook. I went out one afternoon for a smoke on the back deck. It was about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. It was a very quiet, still winter day. It was snowing, those kind of big snowflakes that make it look like the world is moving in slow motion. So, as I was standing there smoking, just staring off in the distance, not looking at anything particular. Looking left, right, up, down at my feet, whatever. I felt something looking at me. Then I looked straight ahead. About 30 feet or less in front of me was the tree line of the forest, and directly in front of me, in between two trees, I see the most gigantic wolf I have ever seen. This thing sitting looked like it was the size of a man standing. It was massive, sitting there and just staring right at me. We locked eyes, then I looked away for a split second and then looked back and it was gone. I don't know, it just gave me the weirdest feeling. It was definitely like, hey, I see you, I could eat you. But I won't, bye, something I'll always remember. 2. I got a good one for wildlife. Was camping at a state park in Texas and went out night fishing with my dog. Rose my bike to the dock and left it about 100 feet from the front of the dock in the parking lot. The dock is still in wet shoreline with that marsh grass for a good 20 to 30 feet before it's actually above the water. Dog and I sitting and fishing for maybe 20 minutes when a massive gator drifted up. I guess he was attracted to my hook splashes because the rest of the lake was dead quiet and still as glass. He looked like a whole tree floating in the water until his eyes hit the dock light and lit up, locked with mine. I continued with my fishing for probably 3 hours while old boy hung around, following me from side to side of the dock. When I decided to leave, he started following me up the shore. I take care around wildlife and I love animals, but I was honestly terrified in that moment. Looking at my bike and knowing gators can run pretty fast and my dog would definitely try to fight it. Figured my only weapon was a distraction and took a piss off the far side of the dock. While Gator Boy was searching my pee water for the dying fish he heard, I took my dog and ran. 3. I live in a really remote part of Alaska. I think the scariest thing I've ever encountered is how silent the woods/tundra can be in the dead of winter. I'm talking like, I feel like I am about to go insane, quiet. It's absolutely unnerving. I become hyper aware of my heartbeat and my breathing sounds like a effing airplane taking off. And I know a lot of people will say, it's because a predator was nearby. Nah man, some places up here just have nothing. That's what really freaks me out. I am absolutely alone in this one spot. I could drop dead and no one would ever find my body. 4. Not sure if this counts, but here goes. I live in my family home. Which is to say my great-grandpa built it and his family lived here all their lives. 2 people have died in here, my great-grandpa and my aunt, both from complications due to stomach cancer. One small but important detail is my aunt used a lot of baby powder to keep herself smelling pleasant, and doubled down on it when the cancer worsened and she lost control over her BMs. Around 4 years ago, I had some friends over for game night and one friend, let's call him Bill, says he smells baby powder. This happens on a semi-frequent basis here. There's even a whiteboard with how many days pass before someone smells it again. Currently we're at a 49-day streak. We continue on with the game for a couple more hours, and Bill excuses himself to the bathroom saying the smell is making him sick. When he comes out, he tells us he saw blood in his puke. We end the game there and his then girlfriend takes him to the ER. We found out a couple weeks later that Bill had a malignant tumor in his stomach. It was operable, thankfully, and he's been doing great, but timing is definitely creepy. Bill and his now wife are pretty well convinced the place is haunted, but that doesn't stop any of them from game night. 5. Coming out of anesthesia from open heart surgery, every time I closed my eyes I could see a perfectly formed brick wall inches from my face. I could see the texture of the bricks through the paint, the mortar, all in perfect detail. Every time I changed rooms, the wall would change colors. 6. This was almost a decade ago. I live in a town outside of Phoenix, Arizona. It was late in the afternoon as the sun was starting to set. I went out in the backyard to smoke a cigarette and play fetch with my dog. As I was throwing the ball, I noticed a small orb shoot from the ground directly into the sky. A few seconds later another one followed, and another, and another, and another. It didn't stop for a few minutes. At first I thought it was a Roman candle, but I just couldn't hear, but you'd normally hear them fizzing as they fly. I couldn't hear anything. It was dead silent. To this day, I still don't know what those were. 7. It happened when me and my parents were on vacation to some place near Spain when I was still little. We went to a little beach at some coastal town where I then immediately jumped into the sea with my swimming goggles on. I then crawled onto some rocks and walked around until I noticed a crab sitting on the rocks. I then traversed them carefully while trying to catch it, but it kept crawling away. This continued until I then followed it to a point where the little bay I was in ended and the open ocean began. So then little me decided that it was a good idea to jump into the open water to see if there was anything cool down there. I then jumped in, and I was immediately hit with the cold temperature of actual ocean water. But the worst part was that even with my goggles on, I couldn't see anything down there. I was met with a giant black void. No fish, no plants, no rocks. Nothing. I then immediately turned around and began swimming back as quick as I could. And since that moment I haven't gone beyond the shallows ever again. 8. Lived on a ranch in the mountains. Used to take the trash out early in the mornings. One morning I'm walking to the dumpsters and I see a massive mountain lion laying on top of the dumpsters. Guess he wasn't too hungry because I'm still writing this. 9. I grew up in rural Appalachia, so I grew up hearing all kinds of superstitions and legends about ghosts and other creepy things. Of course, as an adult I realized they were mostly made up by people trying to scare their kids from wandering off into the woods and passed down over the generations. I was told to never respond if something called my name in the woods, and if we heard whistling outside at night it meant the devil was close. Of course there's real truth and valuable advice in some of those stories. If a stranger is calling to you in the woods or whistling outside your house at night, you probably should be afraid, especially as a child. I never experienced either there in the mountains. The scariest thing that ever happened to me wasn't supernatural and happened in New Mexico. My mom died when I was very little, and when I was 20 my dad passed away, leaving me without immediate family except my brother. Dad didn't have much, but he left his house to my brother and just enough money to me that I was able to buy 2 acres and a nice used camper. My boyfriend, now my husband, wanted to move back home and be close to his mom, and we planned to eventually build a house. It seemed like such a cool adventure to me at the time. It was literally in the desert, a Director T lot off a Director T road with no electricity or water access and surrounded by other identical empty plots. Until very recently you could still find land like that for a little bit of nothing because it's inconvenient and expensive to truly live comfortably out there. We had to haul water from my in-laws' house and use a generator for electricity. My husband worked nights as a security guard, so I was alone in that camper almost every night. Honestly, it was boring, and it felt safe enough to me then because I had a big bear of a Rottweiler named Zeus who would have defended either of us to the death. Obviously though, as I'd find out, it wasn't really that safe, dog or not. It was a normal night like any other. I had been outside watching the sky while I smoked a bowl and came back in to get ready for bed. I had just undressed and climbed into bed when I heard whistling and felt the camper sort of shift like a hard gust of wind hit it. It wasn't that unusual because sometimes the wind blew really hard out there, so I would have ignored it if Zeus hadn't started growling like the devil himself was outside. He was crouched down toward the doorway ready to attack. I was terrified, and it suddenly seemed so foolish to have assumed I was safe out there alone with a thin aluminum door between me and whoever/whatever was out there in the dark. I couldn't help but think about the story my granddad told me all those years ago about hearing whistling at night, and while I'm not very religious in general, I'd be lying if I said it wasn't pretty unnerving in that moment. The sound of it was so unnaturally high-pitched that it almost sounded like the wind, but not quite, because it had a sort of sad melody to it. Besides that, my dog had never growled at the wind before. I remember thinking how crazy it was. I could hear it over the generator and I couldn't tell where it was coming from. It sounded like it was everywhere. I tried to work up the courage to peek outside, but I was frozen to the bed. Zeus was going crazy now, growling and snarling and pacing. He rarely barked, but when he did it was intimidating as hell, and once he started barking at the wall like he was possessed, everything sort of stopped. It was like the tension in the air just slowly dissipated. Zeus was just as freaked out as me and couldn't settle down until I finally let him outside about an hour later. He sniffed the back of the camper where the bedroom was for a good minute before reluctantly turning away and coming back inside, but I was too chicken crap to go outside myself. Cell service was spotty. This was a long time ago when everyone still had flip phones, and I was without a way to leave or call for help. When I told my husband the next morning, he was convinced it was traffickers or worse trying to break in on me and Zeus had scared them off. It was somewhat plausible to me, but I didn't feel that was the explanation. No one had actually tried to break in. That would be some strange kidnappers, to just stand outside whistling. Then he told me he'd heard rumors of a small cult who lived somewhere out there, and maybe it was some of them trying to scare us away. That was more terrifying to me in a way, since I figured if that was the case they might come back, but in the daylight with my husband there it also seemed a bit silly. I remembered how Zeus was sniffing the back of the camper and we decided to go look around. The director T out there is soft and sandy and looked like it had been trampled around in by multiple people with different sized bare feet. The director T that was right under the small window over our bed. The weirdest part is how there were no tracks leading off in any other direction away from the camper. Just the ones outside the window and one set halfway around the back side wall, right around where Zeus had started barking. Suddenly that crazy cult rumor didn't seem very far-fetched or silly to me, and that's how I ended up living with my mother-in-law for over a year, because fork living in fear of being harassed or worse. We still own the lot where that happened, but we bought a place in town. The desert is beautiful and I love hiking in it with other people, but at the same time I've noticed something about it also really seems to attract crazy folks. 13. I was on a backwoods backpacking trip some years back with friends and we stumbled upon a very makeshift and rundown cabin. There was no indication that anyone had been there in a while, but out back there was a hand-carved cross that looked like it used to be a grave marker. Also several old food tins and some broken whiskey bottles. 14. In the 80s, in the Sacramento mountains of New Mexico, my younger sister, 12, and I, 16, were camping in a very secluded area. Something woke me up. I could hear the horses grazing, so hoped that meant not a predator, bear, mountain lion, etc. But still something wasn't right. This was during the time of Red Dawn. Remember that movie? Through the tent I could see a couple dim lights, like someone or several someones were walking up the director T path carrying a flashlight. Holy cow, why would someone be here unless they knew we were here? I woke my sister up and we snuck out the tent, both of us terrified. Past the horses into the trees and watched. Turns out it was fireflies, the first time I had ever seen them. So rare in NM. 15. I once worked as a housing inspector. A new client had purchased a house and I was tasked to go and inspect it. From the information on hand, the house was a very old home, built 1908, and was quite the derelict. I was in no hurry to inspect the house in my honest opinion, so scheduled it for my last stop of the day. I did my jobs as per normal and then made my way to the house. I parked my car on the road and as I walked up the path, nothing extraordinary jumped out at me. It was a run-down 3-story house. For me, it was just your run-of-the-mill wreck. I guess the buyers had walked through and seen some potential in the home, but I could see none. It was getting on to dusk and as I didn't have the key for the front door, I made my way around to the rear of the property to access the rear door. As I came around the back of the house I noticed that the back door itself opened up into a large kitchen. What caught me at that point in time was, as the sun began to set behind me, I could feel a drastic change of air temperature. It was late summer and I assumed this was the reason for the drop in temp. I turned to look at the sunset, noting that the cloud cover gave the sky a nice crimson hue. I turned back towards the door and that's when I saw it. On the other side of the kitchen was a door that led into a hallway which in turn led to the front door. The front door had colored glass. But what was standing in the darkness of the hallway, to this day, still makes the hair of my neck stand up. There was a silhouette of man. Judging from the build, I could tell it was a man. There was no distinguishable features to see, just a black silhouette. What happened next froze me to the spot. Where his face was, two eyes opened. And they were the color red. Unblinking and unmoving, those eyes glowed red and I could tell they were looking right at me. At first I couldn't look away. Those red orbs seemed to stare straight into my soul and I found myself transfixed staring back. Every fiber in me told me I should run but I could not move. I stared unblinking at the red eyes and they in turn stared unblinking back at me. My eyes began to water and I blinked to clear them but as I opened my eyes again, the silhouette was gone. I freaked. I quickly ran around the house, jumped in my car and sped home. What would normally take me 25 minutes to drive home, only took me 10 as I couldn't get away fast enough. In my report I wrote that the house and some structural issues that could not be remedied in the house was eventually torn down. In its place is now a housing unit with 6 3-bedroom homes. I have heard stories from tradesmen who have been on site at night and all have said that they felt a cold chill every time they go there. I did look up the history of the property but nothing unusual jumped out at me. Up to that point in my life, I never believed in the supernatural or the paranormal. Even now I am skeptical of most things. But I know what I saw was pure evil and I have never had an encounter like it since.